Hey guys, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be talking about how to create a deer trail, a deer travel corridor, a steering tunnel, a sidewalk, whatever you want to call it. Basically how we're going to get the deer to move from point A to point B on our property using the travel route that we want them to. And throughout these videos, we're going to be talking about a few things. First, we're going to be talking about the why. Why are we putting in these deer trails on our property? And then we're going to be kind of getting into how we're actually creating these deer trails or these travel corridors. And then finally, to wrap it up, I'm going to be giving you guys a few examples of the deer trails that we created last year on this property. And we're actually standing on one of those trails right now. So as you can see behind me, there's a trail that runs right past me and it goes behind the camera and then it hooks to the left behind the camera. So we're going to be giving you more examples of the deer trails that we've created on this property towards the end of the video. But first, let's talk about why we're creating these deer trails on our property. If you don't have any improvements on your property whatsoever, you're still probably going to be having deer move through your property. But the more improvements that you make, the more predictable the deer movement becomes. So if you put in a food plot, that's likely where those deer are going to be moving in the afternoon to feed. The same thing with a bedding location. If you make a bedding area on your property, there's a good chance that as those deer come off the food sources in the morning, they're going to be heading towards your bedding areas in the morning. And that's where they're going to be spending most of the day on your property, in those thick bedding areas. Now, if you have both bedding areas and food plots on your property, you're going to already have pretty consistent deer movement, right? You're going to be having deer come from the bedding and move to the food in the afternoon. That's a pretty consistent movement, and it makes it a lot easier for you to hunt those deer. However, if you haven't created deer trails on your property, that movement from bedding to feeding can still be pretty random. You could have several trails leading from bedding to feeding or from feeding to bedding. And this is where creating your own deer trail comes in. You want to give those deer a very secure way to get from point A to point B that also increases your hunting opportunities. To give you guys a better idea on how this particular trail is set up, our property is kind of a skinny rectangle that runs north to south, and this trail runs north to south, parallels our property borders. It's about 50 yards on the interior of our property. And what this allows me to do is walk the property edge and cut into several stands, giving me multiple opportunities to hunt this trail without ever putting too much pressure on the interior of my property. This particular trail is on the east side of my property, and I have created another one on the west side. So depending on whatever the wind is that day, I have multiple hunting opportunities on these deer trails. Once you have a general idea as to how you want these deer to travel through your property, the next step is to actually create the deer trail. And depending on what type of habitat you have, there are a few different ways to actually create the deer trail. First, if you're trying to create a deer trail through thick, high stem count cover, this is going to be one of the easier deer trails to create. Deer are pretty lazy and will take the path of least resistance most of the time. So by creating a trail through high stem count cover, they will naturally start gravitating towards this path. And if you wanted to give them a little extra encouragement to use your trail, what you can do is hinge cut a tree perpendicular to your trail. This is going to make it pretty annoying for them to leave your trail because they're not going to really want to jump over that hinge cut. Now they will every once in a while, but it's a lot easier for them to stay on the path. So if you hinge cut a tree on the right side perpendicular to your trail, you can walk about 10 yards and hinge cut a tree to the left side of your trail. So this keeps them moving right down the middle. Now you do not want to hinge cut every single tree down the entire path. What this is going to do is it's going to make that trail feel very enclosed, and you do not want these deer to feel trapped. You want to make sure that these deer can leave the trail and escape a predator if they need to. If you have every single tree down the entire trail hinge cut without any escape paths, the deer will probably still use it every once in a while, but they're not going to use it as frequently as if you have just hinge cut a tree every once in a while, giving them multiple escape routes. If you're someone that has more open hardwoods on your property and you're trying to create a deer trail or a steering tunnel or a travel corridor, I'm not gonna lie, it's gonna be a lot more work for you guys, but you do still need to create these trails. Deer, and especially bucks, they do not want to leave the security and the safety of their bedding areas to travel through open hardwoods to get to that food source. You need to make sure that they can get from point A to point B while staying in cover. And this is where the hard work comes in. Now, the first thing that you need to do in a closed canopy open woodlot setting is you need to start dropping the larger trees where you want these deer to travel through, because you want that sunlight to hit the forest floor. Now, you're just dropping these trees, so it doesn't really matter which way you're dropping them, but if they do happen to fall on the path that you want these deer to take, you are going to have to block them up to make sure that you have a clear path from point A to point B. Once you have these larger trees on the ground from the bedding area to the food source, then you can start hinging those smaller trees. And just like we said before, everything is being hinged away from the trail when possible, perpendicular to the trail. This is going to put instant cover at deer level, and because you're hinging the trees perpendicular to the trail, you can come in and make escape routes off the trail. If you had dropped the trees parallel to the trail, if you don't necessarily want to fight tree lean, so sometimes it's going to happen, but if that was the case where you dropped a tree parallel and then that's where you want your escape route to be, you're going to have to come in and cut that tree in half to open up that escape route. So if you are able to drop those trees perpendicular to your trail, it makes it a lot easier to make your escape routes, and the deer won't feel as claustrophobic when using the trail if you were to drop everything parallel. Again, those of you creating deer trails through open hardwoods, it is going to be a lot more work, and it's also going to take a lot more time for your trail to thicken up. But the big thing is get those trees on the ground, let the sunlight hit the forest floor. Over time, the sides of the trail will only get thicker, and as you maintain the trail, you're going to be conditioning those deer to use this trail from generation to generation. One thing to keep in mind when you are creating these trails is try your hardest to not make them in a straight line, but have them wind through your property instead. And there's a few reasons for this. The first is to make your property feel bigger. You can make 10 acres feel like 40 if you have winding trails through your property. The deer have to spend much more time walking this trail if it's winding as opposed to if it was just straight. The second reason is for stress and safety. If you can wind this trail, then you're able to hide more deer. You could have one group of deer on one section of your trail, but as the trail winds, you could have another group of deer just around the next corner, and these deer never have to see each other. The same thing goes with predators. If you have a predator on that trail, it's not going to be able to see very far. It's going to have to walk through the entire trail to find deer. And this is also going to help you out during the rut. When that buck is searching for does, if you have a trail that is straight, he can just cut that trail, look one way and look the other way. If he doesn't see any deer, he can just continue moving through. But if you have a winding trail through your property, that buck now has to do a lot more work, and he has to search that entire trail instead of having it easy with looking just one way and looking the other, seeing no deer, and moving on. As far as how wide I make the deer trails, there are two main types of deer trails that I personally make. This particular trail that we're on right here is on the larger side. I think it's anywhere from 6 to 8 feet wide, depending on where you are in the trail. And over time, it does get a little bit smaller as you get brush that starts growing in, encroaching on your trail. But when I'm making these trails, I'm making them anywhere from 6 to 8 feet wide. And these trails right here are the ones that I have wrapping around my entire property. And I would say that these trails are the ones that have the most deer traffic on our properties. And kind of how I landed on 6 to 8 feet is really just for maintenance purposes. I just make them wide enough so I can get my riding mower through here. And again, that makes it much easier for maintenance during the growing season. So I can keep everything mowed down while everything else is growing up, giving those deer a nice, easy path to get from point A to point B. Now, I wouldn't really recommend making these much wider than 8 feet. You don't want to make it so wide that the deer feel exposed. Remember, you want them to feel safe moving from their bedding areas to their feeding locations or from those food plots back into the bedding. If you make it too wide, they might not feel safe. But I found that even in areas with very high hunting pressure here in Michigan, that making these trails in the 6 to 8 foot wide range still works really well to promote deer traffic. And the second type of deer trail that I like to make, and I'll briefly touch on this, are buck sneak trails. And the actual creation of the trail is no different than these larger main trails, but I don't like to make these trails as wide. I'm only making them about 3 feet wide max, and I'm placing them on the downwind side of these main trails. So as you can see, this particular trail runs from behind the camera to me all the way to a food plot about 70 yards in this direction. Now, I also have a buck sneak trail about 15 yards on the downwind side of this trail. And the reason that I'm doing this is because not every single buck wants to take this main trail. Now, they will if they're on a hot doe, but sometimes they want to stay in cover and use their nose to check this trail. And so when creating these buck sneak trails, I'm just trying to create a trail to give them a path to do what they already want to do on their own. And if you do not make a buck sneak trail, a lot of times you're going to notice after a few years, after creating a food plot or creating a bedding area or creating one of these trails, is you're going to see a very faint trail show up on the downwind side. And that's your buck sneak trail. That's this trail that you want to be hunting during the rut. But if you can make that buck sneak trail for them, then there's just a greater chance that that's the trail he's going to be using on the downwind side of this main trail. So hopefully that makes sense. Now I kind of want to show you guys a few examples of the different deer trails that I've made on this property. So right now we're standing on the trail that we were just on. We just kind of moved closer to the food plot. And this trail was not here last year. The deer were not using this area very much. If they were, it was very random. So what I did is I kind of went through this thicker area here. It was more open behind the camera. So what I did is I created one of those larger trails that I talked about earlier. And hopefully you can see the deer use on this trail. All of this was in the last 24 hours. We got a pretty significant snowfall yesterday. So all of this deer traffic was within the last 24 hours. So I just kind of wanted to show you guys what one of those main trails looks like and just how much deer use you get after installing one of these things. Again, it has to make sense on your property. This is connecting bedding behind the camera to a food source in this direction. So you just want to make sure that you're not just creating these things randomly on your property. You know, this is on the outer edge of my property, so I can hunt on the outside, shoot into this trail, but I'm also giving the deer a nice, easy way to get from bedding to feeding. Okay, so this is one of the main trails on my property. All right, so now we're on one of our smaller trails, one of our buck sneak trails, and I just kind of want to show you guys what this one looks like. Again, this one is placed about 15 to 20 yards downwind of the main trail, and you can see that we are getting a lot of traffic on this trail as well. And just because I'm calling it a buck sneak trail, that does not mean that only bucks are going to be using this trail. This trail is used by all kinds of deer, but during the rut, if you're sitting on the downwind side of this trail, you have a pretty good chance of catching a buck as he's coming through trying to scent check that main trail. And I just wanted to kind of show you guys the difference. This trail is not very wide. It's probably only wide enough for me to walk through. And how I'm maintaining this particular trail is I'm just walking up and down with a handsaw, cutting the multiflora roseback and all the brush that kind of grows into the trail. And then I'm also walking up and down the trail with a backpack sprayer and just spraying ground clear on the trail. So nothing actually grows on the trail. I kind of trim back the brush that starts encroaching on my trail. Just to kind of keep it open so the deer continue to use it. But these buck sneak trails placed on the downwind side of a main trail or a food plot or a bedding area, these trails are really great to hunt during the pre-rut and the rut, and they're also pretty fun to walk post-season because this is where you're going to find a lot of your rubs. As you can see on this elderberry bush right here, we have one of the rubs right here, and there's several more as you go down the trail. But I just want to kind of give you guys an example of both types of trails, both the kind of the main trail that we make that you can also probably put into a food plot trail if you wanted to, and then also the smaller buck sneak trails. If you guys do have any questions on making deer trails, please feel free to drop those in the comment section below. I'll get back to those as soon as I can, and we will see you guys in the next video.